Iron Creek, Texas, was the kind of town where people knew their neighbors, where the land was tough but the folks were tougher. It had stood the test of time, droughts, recessions, even the slow creep of modern life pulling younger generations away. But nothing had prepared it for what was coming. Los Reyes Cartel had set their sights on the town, moving in like a slow, poisonous fog. They didn't come with guns blazing, not at first. They came with money, sweet promises of prosperity, buying up land and businesses. And for those who refused, well, the message was clear enough. John Grizz Walker wasn't about to be bought, nor was he the kind of man to be intimidated. At 70 years old, he had seen war, had built his ranch from nothing, and had spent the last 15 years raising a creature as fierce and untamed as the land itself. A 1,000-pound grizzly, bear named Spirit. The cartel thought they were dealing with an old man past his prime. What they didn't expect was that they weren't just up against him, they were up against a bear and an entire town that refused to back down. What would you do? Stand and fight, or walk away? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this story is just getting started. Iron Creek had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where life moved at its own steady pace. The people here had deep roots, bound not just by family but by the land itself. Ranchers, farmers, old war vets, men and women who knew how to endure, how to hold on through tough times. It wasn't a town that changed easily, and maybe that was why outsiders rarely stayed long. John Grizz Walker had lived in Iron Creek for most of his life. He'd fought in wars, seen cities rise and fall, and yet the only place that ever felt like home was right here, on the land his father had worked before him. His ranch sat on the edge of town, a stretch of rugged terrain filled with hills, pine trees, and a few crumbling fences that had seen better days. It was there, 15 years ago, that he found the bear. He'd been out checking the far side of his property when he heard it, low, pained growls coming from a thicket. John had seen plenty of wounded animals before, but this was different. As he stepped closer, he spotted a small grizzly cub, barely old enough to fend for itself, caught in a rusted trap. The sight of it hit him harder than he expected. Most folks in these parts wouldn't think twice about putting a wounded animal out of its misery, especially a predator like that. But John saw something in the cub's dark eyes, fear, pain, but also something else, a fight, a refusal to give up. He spent the next few hours prying the rusted metal apart, cursing the poachers who had likely set it. The cub was too weak to run, too hurt to resist, as John wrapped it in his old army jacket and carried it back to the ranch. At first, he figured he'd do what he could to help, then set it free when it was strong enough. But something changed in those first few months. The cub, who he'd named Spirit, healed faster than expected, and instead of running, he stayed. Maybe he knew he owed John his life. Maybe he just felt safer here. Either way, by the time Spirit was fully grown, the two had formed a bond that couldn't be broken. John never kept him locked up. Spirit had the run of a few acres, a protected area John had built just for him. The bear could leave any time he wanted, but he never did. The people of Iron Creek got used to seeing the old rancher and his bear. It became something of a legend in town, a story newcomers never believed until they saw it with their own eyes. Spirit wasn't a pet. He was something more. A guardian, a companion, a piece of the land itself. But not everyone saw it that way. The trouble started slow, almost unnoticeable. A new company rolled into town, Los Reyes Holdings. They started buying up land, offering cash that was hard to turn down, especially for the struggling ranchers. Then came the changes. Small businesses suddenly found themselves buried under new regulations. Permits that had never been a problem before were now impossible to get without the right connections. And then there were the disappearances. Rancher on the outskirts went missing after refusing to sell his land. The sheriff, once a good man, stopped answering questions. People learned to keep their heads down, to look the other way. John knew exactly what was happening. He'd seen it before, in places far from home. The cartel wasn't just moving in. They were sinking their claws in, turning Iron Creek into something it was never meant to be. He figured they'd come for him eventually. His land was valuable, rugged, remote, perfect for whatever business they were looking to set up. But what he hadn't expected was why they came. It wasn't just about the land. Somewhere along the way, they found out about Spirit. Maybe it was some cartel big shot who thought owning a grizzly would be a sign of power. Maybe they saw the bear as leverage, something they could use to force John, or the town, into submission. Either way, the message was clear. They were coming for the bear. John didn't scare easy. He'd spent his life standing his ground against men far worse than the ones who had just rolled into town. But this was different, because this time he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Spirit. And Iron Creek? Well, the cartel was about to find out that some places don't go down without a fight. The sun hung low over Iron Creek, casting long shadows across John Walker's ranch. The air was thick with the scent of pine and dust, a quiet stillness stretching over the land. He sat on his porch, whittling a piece of wood, watching Spirit roam near the far fence. The bear was restless that evening, pacing in a way John hadn't seen in a long time. Animals had a way of sensing things before men did: storms, danger, death. John took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze shifting when a black SUV rumbled up his long dirt driveway, stopping just outside the front gate. He didn't need to see the license plate to know who they were. Two men stepped out, their boots crunching against gravel. The one in front was tall, sharp-eyed, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt that looked out of place in the dust of Iron Creek. The other was bulkier, a shaved head glistening under the fading light. The first man smiled. It was the kind of smile John had seen before. Polished, practiced, and completely empty. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. My name is Manuel Vasquez, but most people call me El Lobo." John didn't move. He just set his coffee down, glanced at the bear still pacing in the distance, then looked back at the men. "Don't believe we've met," he said, voice steady. "No, we haven't," El Lobo admitted. "But I know a lot about you. Decorated veteran, hard-working rancher, a man of principles." He gestured toward the land. "Beautiful place you've got here. Peaceful. I'd hate to see that change." John leaned forward slightly. "You drove all this way to talk about real estate?" El Lobo let out a small chuckle. "Something like that. See, my employers are looking to expand. Your land, well, it fits into our plans perfectly. We're prepared to make you a generous offer. Much more than market value. You'd be able to retire comfortably. Maybe move somewhere without the stress that's coming." John's jaw tightened. "Not for sale." El Lobo's smile didn't fade, but his eyes darkened. "I figured you'd say that, and I respect a man who values his land. But this isn't just about you, Mr. Walker. Things are changing in Iron Creek. The sheriff, he understands that. The town council, they're starting to understand it too. This is happening, whether you like it or not." John stared at him, unblinking. "Then I reckon you wasted a trip." The cartel man exhaled through his nose, as if slightly disappointed but not surprised. "That's unfortunate. Because, you see, resistance comes with consequences." John stood up. "Get off my land." El Lobo studied him for a moment before giving a slow nod. "We'll talk again soon." They got back into the SUV, tires kicking up dust as they pulled away. John watched them disappear down the road, his hands clenched into fists. He knew men like that. They weren't bluffing. That night, the first shots were fired, not with guns, but with fire. The Mercer family's barn went up in flames just after midnight. By the time the fire department got there, it was too late to save anything. Horses had to be cut loose, running wild into the night. Then came the vandalism. The grocery store, owned by a local couple for 30 years, was ransacked. Windows shattered, shelves toppled, spray-painted messages left behind. Change or be changed. The sheriff? Nowhere to be found. The town was starting to buckle under the pressure. Some people packed up and left, others looked the other way. But John wasn't the kind of man to run. Still, what happened next? He never saw it coming. It was a cold, quiet night when they came for Spirit. John had fallen asleep in his chair by the fireplace, boots still on. He wasn't sure what woke him. The sudden stillness, the way the wind had died down, the nagging feeling in the back of his skull that something wasn't right. Then he heard it. A low, muffled growl, followed by the heavy clank of metal. John shot up, grabbing the rifle by the door as he rushed outside. The first thing he saw was the open gate. Spirit's enclosure had been cut open. The thick chains snapped like twigs, then his eyes dropped to the ground. Blood. His gut twisted, the dirt was disturbed, dragged, leading toward the road. And there, tire tracks deep in the soil, disappearing into the night. John's grip tightened around the rifle. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something colder. Spirit was gone, and John Walker was about to bring hell to anyone who had a hand in it. John Walker had been through a lot in his 70 years. Wars, hard winters, the loss of loved ones. But nothing had ever burned him like this. Spirit wasn't just some animal. He wasn't just a bear. He was family, and someone had taken him. There was only one place John knew to go where men like him still understood the meaning of loyalty. The Rusty Spur was the kind of bar where outsiders didn't walk in without good reason. It sat on the edge of town, nestled between an abandoned grain mill and a truck stop that barely stayed in business. The windows were covered in grime, the neon cold beer sign flickering half dead. But inside was where the real heart of Iron Creek beat. John pushed through the heavy wooden door, stepping into a dimly lit room filled with the scent of whiskey, sweat, and old leather. The place was alive with low voices, the occasional burst of laughter, and the unmistakable sound of pool balls cracking against each other. At the back, seated in a booth beneath a faded American flag, was the man he had come to see. Once, he had been Sergeant First Class Murphy, a Special Forces operator with more confirmed kills than he liked to admit. Now he was the leader of the Iron Riders, a group of bikers made up of ex-military, ranchers, and the kind of men who didn't fit anywhere else. John walked up to the booth. Tank didn't look up right away. He was nursing a glass of bourbon, the ice clinking softly. His broad shoulders barely fit in the booth, and his beard, now flecked with gray, gave him the look of a man who had seen too much. "I heard," Tank finally said. John didn't sit. "I need men," he said flatly. Tank let out a slow breath, setting his glass down. He looked up, and there was something in his eyes. The old fire, the one that never quite goes out in men like him. "Cartel took your bear," Tank said, shaking his head. "Jesus, John, what the hell do they want with him?" John clenched, his jaw. "Control. They take Spirit, they control me, they own this town." Tank nodded, rolling his shoulders like he was already preparing for a fight. "And what's the plan?" John's voice was cold. "We take him back." Tank let out a low chuckle. "Hell, I was hoping you'd say that." By the next morning, Iron Creek was different. Word had spread fast. The ranchers, the ones who had refused to sell their land to Los Reyes, were the first to step up. The veterans, men who had fought in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, came next. Then came the hunters, the ones who had spent their whole lives tracking in these woods. By noon, John's ranch was full. Old pickups and motorcycles lined the dirt road. Men leaned against their trucks, rifles slung over their shoulders. Women brought supplies, food, medical kits, ammunition. This wasn't just about a bear anymore. This was about Iron Creek itself. If they let the cartel win, if they let them keep spirit, they'd never stop. They'd take the town piece by piece, until there was nothing left of it but fear and silence. An old rancher named Walt Henderson, who had nearly lost his property to cartel intimidation, spit into the dirt and said, "Well, hell, if they want a war, I say we give 'em one." And that was that. Inside John's barn, Tank laid out the strategy. "We're not running in blind," he said, tapping a map spread across the workbench. "Cartel's got resources we don't. Firepower, money, corruption. But we've got something. They don't." "Yeah?" someone asked. Tank grinned. "We know this land better than they ever will." John leaned forward. "Where's Spirit?" Tank's second-in-command, Lion Ramirez, a former Marine sniper, pointed to a location south of town. "We tracked their movements. Looks like they took him to an old cannery outside of Fairmont. It's off the main roads, real isolated. Perfect place to stash something, or someone." John's gut twisted. "They won't keep him alive long if they think I'm not cooperating." Tank nodded. "That's why we hit them tonight." The group split into two teams. Tank and the riders would follow cartel movements, keeping them occupied and gathering intelligence. John and the others would prepare for the assault, because once the shooting started, there was no turning back. "Sheriffs in their pocket," Walt muttered. "We can't count on the law." John's voice was steel. "We never have." Tank cracked his knuckles. "Well then," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face, "let's remind these bastards why Iron Creek ain't the kind of place you take without a fight." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, John stood by Spirit's empty enclosure. The silence felt heavier than it ever had before. Dorothy, his sister, walked up beside him. "You sure about this?" she asked. John didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the land, the place he had built, the place he had fought for his whole life. He thought about Spirit, alone in some cartel compound, drugged and chained. Then he thought about Iron Creek, the only home he had ever known. John tightened his grip on his rifle. "They want to take what's ours," he said quietly. "They think they can break us." He exhaled, turning toward the dirt road where the first set of headlights appeared in the distance. Tank's riders, rolling in, ready for war. John Walker wasn't just sure, he was ready, and by the time this night was over, Iron Creek would never be the same again. The moon hung low over the Texas desert, casting long shadows across the dirt roads leading to the abandoned cannery. The place was falling apart. Rusted metal, shattered windows, nature, slowly reclaiming the building. But tonight, it wasn't empty. Inside, the Los Reyes cartel had set up camp. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their radios crackling with low murmurs in Spanish. Trucks idled near the loading docks, engines humming as smugglers prepped for transport, and locked in a reinforced steel cage, drugged but still breathing, was Spirit. The cartel planned to move him before dawn, smuggling him across the border for whatever twisted purpose their bosses had in mind. They thought they had everything under control. They were dead wrong. A half-mile away, crouched in the brush along the ridgeline, John Walker, Tank Murphy, and a dozen other men watched the compound through binoculars. The roar of distant motorcycles had long since faded, their bikes hidden in the hills. This wasn't a charge through the front door kind of job. Tank tapped the map spread across the hood of a truck. 2 watchtowers, a dozen guards on rotation. Looks like most of their guys are inside. John's voice was calm. Spirit? Lion Ramirez, their sniper, adjusted his scope. Caged. Looked sedated, probably tranked him up heavy. John exhaled through his nose, his fists clenched. We're getting him out, whatever it takes. Tank smirked. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The attack begins. They moved fast and silent, spreading out like ghosts. Lion took the first shot. A guard dropped from the tower, his body crumpling before he even knew he was dead. Then, everything exploded into motion. A second later, headlights flared in the distance, engines revving as the Iron Riders tore down the road, drawing. Attention away from the real attack. Move! Tank barked, and they surged forward. Gunfire erupted, bullets snapping through the air as Cartel soldiers scrambled for cover. John moved like a man half his age, ducking behind crates, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he took down two men trying to flank them. The bikers hit hard and fast, overwhelming the cartel's outer defenses. Knives flashed in the dark, fists cracked against bone. The sound of close-quarter combat echoed through the cannery's rusted halls. Then came the sound that changed everything, a low, guttural growl. John barely had time to react before a deep roar shook the ground. Inside the compound, Spirit had begun to stir. The drugs had worn off just enough for his instincts to kick in. A cartel guard made the mistake of getting too close to the cage, tapping the bars with a rifle. Spirit's massive paw lashed out, claws catching the man's arm. A scream rang through the camp. Then, with a mighty shove, the bear slammed his full weight against the steel. The door buckled. Another shove. The lock snapped. The bear was loose. Panic ripped through the cartel's ranks. Gunfire erupted in all directions. As their own men scrambled to survive, Spirit wasn't thinking. He was hunting. A man turned to run. Spirit was faster. A second guard raised his weapon. The bear was on him before he could fire. John saw the chaos unfolding, his heart pounding. "Spirit!" he called. The bear's massive head snapped toward. The voice, recognition flickering in his dark eyes. For a split second, everything paused. Then, Spirit turned, ignoring the panicked cartel men, and charged straight for John. The old rancher stepped forward, his rifle lowered, his voice steady. "It's me, boy. We're going home." Spirit skidded to a stop just feet away. His nostrils flared, his ears twitched. But then, he let out a low chuff. It was over, except it wasn't. A voice cut through the night. "Walker!" John turned, and there, standing atop a pile of crates, was El Lobo. Manuel Vasquez. El Lobo was covered in dust and sweat, a pistol in one hand, a machete in the other. Behind him, the last of his men were either dead, running, or too afraid to move with a 1,000-pound grizzly roaming free, but El Lobo wasn't scared. His eyes locked onto John. "This town should have learned its place," he snarled. "And you should have just taken the damn money." John squared his shoulders. "I don't kneel to men like you." El Lobo grinned. "Then you die standing." And just like that, he charged. John barely dodged the first swing of the machete, the blade biting into the wooden crate behind him. He fired his rifle once, but El Lobo was already moving, the bullet grazing his shoulder. The cartel boss tackled him, the two men crashing to the ground. It was old strength versus young rage. John fought like hell, blocking the blade with his forearm, pain searing as it cut deep. He drove his fist into El Lobo's ribs, then his knee, but the younger man didn't let up. El Lobo reared back, ready to bring the machete down one last time. And then Spirit roared. The bear lunged, slamming his bulk into El Lobo, sending him flying across the ground. John scrambled up, grabbing his fallen rifle and leveling it. El Lobo, groaning, pushed himself up, just in time to see Spirit towering over him, teeth bared. He froze. John spat blood onto the dirt. "You want this town?" He growled. "You're gonna have to take it from both of us." El Lobo's fingers twitched toward his gun. John didn't hesitate. One shot, right between the eyes. The cartel boss fell, his body hitting the ground with a thud. Silence. Then the Iron Riders cheered. The cartel was broken. Spirit let out one last mighty roar, then turned, brushing up against John's side. The old rancher laid a hand on the bear's thick fur, his breath coming heavy, his body aching. It was over. John exhaled, looking around at his people. Iron Creek had won, and nobody was taking it away from them again. The final battle began long before the first shot was fired. Word had spread through cartel channels like wildfire. El Lobo was dead. The Iron Creek resistance had crippled Los Reyes's hold on the region, and now the cartel's leadership wanted vengeance. By sunset, armored SUVs and trucks packed with gunmen rolled in from across the border. These weren't the same thugs that had tried to intimidate local ranchers. These were professionals, mercenaries, ex-military, men paid not just to kill, but to wipe entire towns off the map. This wasn't a warning anymore, it was an eradication. The people of Iron Creek had one night to prepare. Tank Murphy took charge, setting up defenses across town. "We fight smart," he told them, standing in the center of the Rusty Spur bar where the town had gathered. "We don't have their numbers, but we have the land. We make them come to us." John stood beside him, his rifle slung over one shoulder. "No one runs. No one surrenders. We fight because this is our home." The ranchers reinforced the roads with barricades, trucks, hay bales, barbed wire. The hunters climbed the rooftops, positioning themselves with long rifles, their scopes scanning the horizon. The Iron Riders split into small teams, hiding in alleyways and behind abandoned buildings, waiting to ambush from the shadows. Dorothy, John's sister, secured the clinic, turning it into a makeshift field hospital with Diana, who worked tirelessly to prepare medical supplies. And then there was Spirit. The 1,000-pound grizzly stood just outside John's ranch, his deep eyes watching the preparations. His wounds from the last battle were healing, but the fire inside him hadn't faded. That night, John stood beside Spirit, running a hand through his thick fur. "You know what's coming, don't you, boy?" The bear grunted, lifting his massive head toward the wind, nostrils flaring. John exhaled. "Then we fight together." It started at dawn. The roar of engines broke the morning stillness as convoys of cartel trucks rolled down Iron Creek's only highway. Heavy-caliber machine guns mounted on their beds spit lead, ripping through fences and store windows. A voice boomed over loudspeakers, echoing through the town. "Iron Creek, you have one chance. Surrender or be buried here." No one moved. Then Tank gave the signal. From the rooftops, snipers fired. From the alleyways, Molotovs rained down, setting cartel trucks ablaze. From the hills, ranchers fired rifles, picking off cartel gunners one by one. The cartel didn't expect a fight like this. Gunfire filled the air as the battle spread across town. John ducked behind an overturned truck, firing at two cartel soldiers who tried to rush a storefront. Tank led a team through the back streets, moving like a military unit, clearing buildings and cutting off cartel reinforcements. And then Spirit charged. The bear moved like a storm, hitting the cartel's flank before they could react. A mercenary turned, his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Spirit slammed into him. The man's body flew 10 feet before crashing into a pile of debris. Another soldier aimed a shotgun. Spirit swiped, claws flashing. The gun clattered to the ground, the man screaming. As he stumbled back, the cartel panicked. They had planned for bullets, not for a bear. But Los Reyes still had firepower. A black SUV rolled into town, its reinforced plating shrugging off bullets. A mercenary stepped out, lifting a rocket launcher onto his shoulder. He aimed at the town hall, where defenders were dug. In John's heart pounded. He lifted his rifle, too far for a clear shot. Spirit saw it first. The bear charged the SUV, moving with terrifying speed. The mercenary turned at the last second, but too late. Spirit slammed his full weight into the vehicle flipping it onto its side. The explosion rocked the street, flames licking into the sky as cartel reinforcements scrambled to escape. But Iron Creek didn't let them. Tank and his men moved in, finishing off the survivors. The cartel's final push had failed. John's last stand, only one man remained standing. The cartel's second-in-command, Santiago Reyes, stepped out from the burning wreckage, a pistol in one hand, a knife in the other. He looked at John, breathing hard. "This town was supposed to be nothing," Santiago muttered. "A backwater full of nobodies." John lifted his rifle. "Guess you miscalculated." Santiago lunged. The two men collided, the pistol going off inches from John's head. The old rancher grunted in pain as the knife slashed his arm, but he didn't stop fighting. He grabbed Santiago's wrist, twisting the blade away, then drove, his fist into the cartel leader's jaw. The younger man stumbled back, spitting blood. John raised his rifle. Click. Out of ammo, Santiago smiled. "Now what, old man?" John braced himself, but he wasn't alone. A deep, menacing growl filled the air. Santiago froze. Behind John, Spirit loomed. The bear's fur was matted with dust and blood. His deep eyes locked onto the cartel leader. Santiago backed up, his hands trembling. You can't be serious," he whispered. John's voice was cold. "You took our town. You took my bear." He pointed toward the wreckage of the cartel convoy. "Now look around. Tell me who's really got control." Santiago's eyes darted for his gun. John didn't give him the chance. One swing, his fist connected, sending Santiago sprawling onto the dirt. The cartel was finished. By sunset, the battle was over. The survivors of Los Reyes fled, leaving behind their weapons, their dead, and whatever power they thought they had. John stood beside Spirit, his hand resting on the bear's thick fur. Tank walked up, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Damn, Walker," he said. "Not bad for an old man." John smirked. "Not bad for a bunch of bikers either." Across town, the people of Iron Creek began picking up the pieces. They weren't just survivors, they were victors. And as the first stars blinked to life over the Texas desert, John looked at Spirit, and the bear looked back. They had fought together, and they had won. By the time the dust settled, Iron Creek was still standing. The battle had scarred the town. Storefronts were riddled with bullet holes, fences were broken, and the streets were littered with the wreckage of cartel trucks. But the people had won. They had fought for their land, their families, and their future. And because of that, Iron Creek wasn't just a town anymore. It was a symbol. Within days, the people of Iron Creek came together to rebuild. Windows were replaced, fences were mended, and every bullet hole became a reminder of the night they refused to back down. Tank and his bikers stayed behind, turning an abandoned warehouse into a new clubhouse for the Iron Riders. "Somebody's got to keep an eye on the place," Tank had said, but everyone knew the truth. Iron Creek had become home. Diana expanded her clinic, now stocked with better supplies than ever before, thanks to donations from grateful ranchers and local businesses. Dorothy took charge of a community fund to help those who had lost homes or livestock in the fight. And John Walker, the man who had never asked for a fight but refused to lose one, stood by his bear, knowing the battle had changed them both. Spirit had suffered wounds of his own, but true to his nature, he healed. For weeks after the battle, he patrolled the outskirts of town, his massive form appearing at the ridgelines at dawn and dusk, as if standing guard. People began leaving food near his enclosure, a quiet way of saying thank you. The children of Iron Creek, once afraid of the massive grizzly, now gathered at the fence to watch him, their eyes filled with awe instead of fear. A vote was held, and before the month was out, the town raised a statue in Spirit's honor. A bronze monument standing tall in the town square captured him in mid-roar, his powerful presence frozen in time. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Spirit, the guardian of Iron Creek. John didn't attend the unveiling. He didn't need to. He knew the bear didn't care for statues, but when he walked by it later that evening, Spirit stood beside him, looking up at the bronze version of himself. The bear huffed. John smirked. "John, not bad, huh?" Spirit just grunted and walked away. As time passed, Spirit's story spread beyond Iron Creek. People from other towns came to see the statue, to hear the legend of the bear who fought alongside men. And something incredible started happening. Other small towns, once too afraid to fight back, took a stand against the gangs, the corrupt officials, and the criminals who had bullied them for years. Iron Creek's defiance ignited something bigger, a belief that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about survival. It's about proving that no one has the right to take what you love. And at the center of it all was Spirit, the bear who had once been caged, but chose to fight. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, John sat on the porch of his ranch, a cup of black coffee in hand. Spirit lay a few yards away, his massive chest rising and falling as he rested, the golden light reflecting off his fur. John exhaled, staring at the horizon. "Didn't think we'd live to see this day, did we, big guy?" Spirit opened one eye, snorted, then closed it again. John chuckled. "Yeah, I guess you're right. No use worrying about the past." He took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle deep in his bones. Then, as if answering some unspoken thought, Spirit stood up, stretched, and let out a deep, rolling grunt. John watched as the bear turned toward the hills, the place he had fought for, the place he had chosen to protect. And then, without hesitation, he walked off into the night, vanishing into the wild. John smiled. "See you around, old friend. Because some bonds aren't meant to be broken, they're meant to be remembered." Iron Creek became more than just a town that had won a battle. It became a legend. A story passed down from one generation to the next about a man, a town, and a bear that refused to surrender. And as long as that story was told, the spirit of Iron Creek would never die. Do you believe that loyalty, friendship, and courage can change the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because some stories are meant to be shared.